You can follow the process correctly and still not get the outcome you expected. And I think a lot of people in construction recognize that feeling. The forms are there, the approvals are there, the insurances are there, the design responsibility matrix is there, the risk register is there, the meeting minutes are there, the method statement is there, the sign-off is there. Everything in theory has been captured. Everything has been allocated. Everything has been recorded. And yet, when you speak to the people actually carrying the project, it does not always feel clearer. Sometimes it feels heavier, because modern construction has become extremely good at answering one question. Who is responsible if something goes wrong? And to be fair, that is not a small question. It matters. Buildings carry risk, projects carry risk, decisions carry risk. People live inside the consequences of what we design and build. So this episode is not an argument against accountability. It is not an argument against insurance. It is not an argument against documentation, contracts, governance, checking, assurance and responsibility. That would be too easy. And it would be wrong. The question is slightly different. What happens when the system becomes so organized around liability that liability starts shaping the behavior of the industry itself? What happens when protecting the project becomes almost as important as delivering the project? What happens when every party is trying to be responsible, but also trying very carefully not to be the one left holding the risk? That is where this episode sits. Not in the dramatic failures, not in the headline disputes, but in the quiet day-to-day adjustments. The careful wording, the extra approval, the reluctance to use a new material, the conservative detail, the email written slightly differently because someone knows it may be read later by someone who was not in the room. The meeting where people agree the wording before they agree the issue. The moment where a technical question becomes a legal one. And once that starts happening often enough, construction changes. Not suddenly, quietly, decision by decision, clause by clause, exclusion by exclusion, premium by premium. People make projects that bring profits, but profits decide which projects get built and what people become because of them. This is Bytnar Talks. People, projects, profits. Hi, I'm Piotr Bytnar, a chartered structural engineer who since 2017 enables clients to do building projects and empowers contractors to deliver them. And I do it through Bytnar Limited, a chartered consulting engineers and design practice. At Bytnar, we work around the parts of projects where technical reality, commercial pressure, coordination, capability and responsibility all start meeting each other. And that is usually where things get interesting. Because on paper, construction can look very structured. There are contracts, of course, there are scopes, there are design responsibilities, insurance requirements, approval gateways, duties and procedures. And in one sense, that structure is necessary. Nobody serious would want an industry built on vague responsibility and casual risk. But in practice, structures do not just control behavior. They create behavior. People adapt to what the system rewards. They adapt to what the system punishes. They adapt to what can be insured and defended. They adapt to what can be proved later. And that is the quiet force behind what I want to call the insurance state. Not the literate state. Not a government department. Not a conspiracy. Just an environment where liability, insurance, risk allocation and defensibility become so deeply woven into construction that they begin to shape how projects are designed, procured, managed, recorded, and delivered. And once you see it, a lot of behaviors that look frustrating begin to make more sense. Not necessarily better, but more understandable. Because sometimes people are not being difficult really, they are being exposed. Sometimes they are not avoiding decisions because they do not care. They are avoiding decisions because the system around them has made certain decisions professionally dangerous. Sometimes organizations are not adding process because they love bureaucracy. They are adding process because somewhere in the background, someone has asked a very simple question. Can we prove we did what we were supposed to do? And that question changes everything. A useful way to think about this is the school trip. Years ago, if you can remember, when you went on one, a teacher could take a group of children out, and the system around that trip was relatively simple. Stay together, look after each other, be back by 4. That was probably the operating model of all of them. Now, before the bus leaves, there are forms, permission slips, medical declarations, emergency contacts, risk assessments, safeguarding procedures, insurance checks. All of it exists for a reason. And to be fair, some of those reasons are good. People learned from harm. Society changed. Expectations changed. And by extension, accountability changed. The trip itself may not have changed that much. The children are still going somewhere and come back. But the system around the trip has expanded. Construction has gone through a similar shift. We've always carried risk. Structural failures, design errors, site accidents, material defects, fire performance, water ingress, ground conditions, coordination failures, operational failures after handover. Those risks are not new. What has changed is the architecture around responsibility. Modern construction is no longer just a technical exercise. It is a legal, commercial, procedural, and insurance architecture designed to allocate responsibility very precisely. And that is not accidental. It came from litigation, from regulation, from failures, from claims, from insurance market reaction, from clients needing protection, from professionals needing boundaries, from contractors needing boundaries, from the reality that when something goes wrong, the cost can be large, long-lasting, and reputationally damaging. So the system responded. More clarity, more accountability, more protection, more documentation, more defined responsibility, and gradually more complexity. That is usually how these things happen, not because someone sits in a room and decides to make construction harder. It happens because every layer solves a real problem. But then the layers accumulate, and eventually the industry is living inside the solution. Now, the obvious place to show this up is professional indemnity insurance. PI insurance is one of those things that people in construction know is important, but outside construction, it is not always well understood. At its simplest, it exists because architects, engineers, consultants, and other professionals make decisions that may affect buildings for decades. A detail specified today can matter long after the fee has been paid. A design assumption can sit quietly inside a building for a long time. A coordination failure can travel through procurement, manufacture, installation, handover, and operation. And if professional error causes loss, somebody needs a financial mechanism to respond. That is the principle. And in principle, it creates confidence. Clients know there is protection. Professionals know they are not personally exposed to catastrophic claims. Projects can proceed because there is a system behind responsibility. But insurance markets have their own logic. Insurers assess risk. They price uncertainty. They react to claims. They narrow cover when exposure becomes difficult to understand. They exclude activities when they cannot price them with confidence. They increase premiums when the environment becomes more volatile. And once insurers change appetite, the industry starts adapting. That is the part people do not always see. Insurance does not simply sit behind construction as a safety net. It quietly shapes construction from inside the decision-making environment. A designer thinks, can this be insured? A consultant thinks, can I defend this later? A contractor thinks, who is carrying the risk? A client thinks, will the market accept this? A funder thinks, is the asset sufficiently protected? A solicitor thinks, has liability been allocated? A project manager thinks, have we captured the decision? None of those thoughts are unreasonable, but together they create a climate. And the climate has consequences. Figure out. At Bytnar, this is the kind of thing we pay attention to because it sits underneath the technical conversation. You may be asked to review a detail, comment on a risk, check an assumption or advise on a project condition. But very often the visible technical question is only part of the story. The deeper question is, what kind of decision environment has this project created? Is it an environment where professionals can exercise judgment clearly? Or is it an environment where everyone is quietly positioning themselves for defensibility? That difference matters big time, because both environments can look professional, both can produce documents, both can produce meetings, both can produce approvals, but they do not produce the same behavior. Oh no. This is where defensive design enters. Now I want to be careful with that phrase because it can sound like criticism. It is not necessarily a criticism. Defensive design is often rational. Imagine a bridge across a river. One option is elegant, efficient, lighter, perhaps more innovative. Another option is heavier, more familiar, more conservative, and built in a way that has been accepted hundreds of times before. Guess which one gets built? Which one gets chosen? People like to think the answer is purely technical, but it rarely is. The decision sits inside a wider environment. Who will approve it? Who will insure it? Who will review it later? What happens if something goes wrong? Would an expert witness say the decision was reasonable? Would the insurer accept the design approach? Would the client understand the risk? Would the contractor be comfortable building it? Would the design team be able to defend the reasoning 10 years later? Suddenly the calculation changes. Not because anyone is anti-innovation, not because engineers do not care about efficiency, not because consultants are lazy, but because when liability exposure increases, professionals naturally favor decisions that reduce personal and organizational risk. Established details, known materials, extra checks, additional sign-offs, conservative assumptions, more documentations, less ambiguity, more evidence, and again, none of that is irrational. If a failure could trigger years of dispute, reputational damage, uninsured exposure, and professional consequences, caution becomes logical. But caution changes culture. It changes the feel of design meetings. It changes how people speak. It changes how quickly options get dismissed. It changes what is considered sensible. Sometimes the question quietly shifts from what is the best solution to what solution can no one argue with later. And that is a very different design environment, isn't it? You can feel it in the language. People say things like, I'm not comfortable signing that off. Has that been used before? What does the warranty provider say? Can we get confirmation from the manufacturer? Who's taking responsibility for that interface? Can you put that in writing? We need to check what our PI allows. Again, these are not silly questions. In many cases, they are exactly the right questions. But if a project becomes dominated by those questions, something starts to shift. The project becomes less about solving the building as a whole and more about each party making sure its exposure is controlled. The technical work continues, but the emotional posture changes. People become careful, conversations become narrower, emails become longer, meetings become more formal, responsibility becomes more fragmented, and the project room starts to feel different. Not chaotic, actually often the opposite. Very controlled, very documented, very cautious, but sometimes not very alive, not very creative, not very collaborative, not very trusting. And that is a strange thing about protection systems. They can protect the project and weaken the conditions that make good project work possible. This is where the client-side listener needs to pay closer attention. Because from a client position, it is very tempting to think that more risk transfer equals more protection. If the contractor carries the risk, that's good. If the consultant carries the risk, that's good too. If the subcontractor carries the risk, again good. If responsibility is tightly defined, well, that's good, all good and dandy. And to some extent, yes. No client should accept vague accountability on a serious project. But risk transfer is not the same as risk elimination. Risk does not disappear because it moved down a contract chain. It simply changes location, and every time it moves, it gets priced. Contractors price it, subcontractors price it, insurers price it, lawyers respond to it, consultants behave around it, program decisions absorb it, procurement decisions reflect it. And sometimes, by the time risk has traveled through the system, the project has not become less risky. It has become more expensive, more cautious, and more fragmented. That is uncomfortable because on paper everything looks protected. The client has transferred responsibility. The main contractor has flowed obligations down. The subcontractor has qualifications. The supplier has exclusions. The consultant has limitations. The insurer has conditions. Everybody has a position. But the building still needs to be designed. The interfaces still need to be coordinated. The information still needs to be good enough. The ground conditions still need to be understood. The materials still need to perform. The site still needs to sequence the work. Reality does not care where the liability sits. Reality simply arrives. This is one of the quiet truths in construction. The contract can allocate responsibility, but delivery still requires capability. And if the capability is not there, the risk will show up somewhere. Maybe in cost, maybe in delay, maybe in rework, maybe in disputes, maybe in overdesign, maybe in design freeze paralysis, maybe in endless RFI cycles, maybe in people quietly refusing to make decisions. That is why at Bytnar, when we look at project risk, we are not only interested in where it has been allocated. We are interested in whether the environment has the capability to manage it. Those are different questions. One is legal, the other one is operational. And projects often confuse them. They believe because risk has been allocated, risk has been dealt with. But allocation is not management. A responsibility matrix does not coordinate an interface. A warranty requirement does not solve a design gap. A disclaimer does not improve buildability. An insurance certificate does not create technical understanding. A contract clause does not make the ground conditions behave better. It just decides who may suffer when reality arrives. And that matters. Think about the fragile package. A fragile package is being passed from one person to another. Whatever that may be, your granny's favorite china set. Each person passes it along, but before they do, they add a note. If it breaks, it was not my responsibility. The next person adds a condition. The next adds a disclaimer. The next adds a qualification. By the time package reaches the end, everyone has carefully recorded who is not responsible for breaking it. But the package itself is still fragile. That is how some projects begin to feel. The issue is not that responsibilities are necessary. The issue is that responsibility becomes fragmented faster than understanding is built. And that creates a strange situation where the project can be administratively sophisticated and practically vulnerable at the same time. There is a lot of clarity about liability, less clarity about reality. And if you have been around complex projects, you will recognize that feeling. Everyone is working hard, everyone is protecting their position, everyone is meeting their obligations, but the whole thing still feels like it is not quite connecting. That is usually where the documentation economy grows. Construction now generates enormous volumes of records, risk registers, method statements, design responsibility matrices, inspections and test plans, compliance reports, assurance reviews, meeting minutes, change logs, approval trackers, technical submissions, review comments, closeout evidence, photographic records, audit trails, and all of this has a purpose. Documentation creates traceability. It shows due diligence. It helps teams understand decisions. It protects people when disputes arise. It can improve quality. It can create continuity when people change roles. It can stop important issues being lost. So again, this is not an argument against documentation, but documentation has a cost. Not just a financial cost, an attention cost, a cognitive cost, a coordination cost, a time cost really, a trust cost sometimes. Because when documentation grows faster than understanding, the project begins optimizing for proof rather than clarity. That is a subtle shift at first. The question is, what do we need to understand? Then it becomes, what do we need to record? Then it becomes, what do we need to protect ourselves? And eventually, in some environments, the system becomes very good at answering, can we prove we followed the process? But less good at answering, are we doing the simple thing well? And I think this is one of the most important parts of the episode, because there is a difference between evidence of activity and evidence of control. A project can produce thousands of pages of documentation and still not have genuine control of its risks. A team can close actions and still not resolve the underlying issue. A meeting can produce minutes and still not create agreement. A risk register can contain the risk and still not change behavior. A design review can identify problems and still not create the authority to resolve them. A tracker can show movement while the project itself is drifting. That distinction matters, because when liability pressure increases, documentation becomes a form of protection. And when documentation becomes protection, people naturally document more. Again, rational, typical human behavior. But the project may then start spending more energy providing it. It is controlled and actually improving control. And that is where capability becomes important, because strong teams do not only produce records, they understand what the record means. They know which issue matter. They know when a document is hiding uncertainty. They know when a sign-off is too early. They know when a qualification is a warning, not a detail. They know when the meeting sounded aligned but the room was not aligned. And they know when the project is using paperwork to compensate for a lack of trust. That is the kind of thing we are interested in at Bytnar. Not paperwork as an enemy. Paperwork is part of serious construction. But paperwork without understanding becomes theater. And theater does not hold up well when reality starts testing the project. Now, there is another layer to this, and it is easy to miss. Insurance companies have quietly become one of the most influential forces in construction practice. Not always visibly, not through public speeches, not by standing on site, not by issuing design instructions, but through insurability. If something cannot be insured, it becomes very difficult to use. If a material cannot get cover, it disappears from serious consideration. If a design approach creates exclusions, people avoid it. If a professional responsibility becomes impossible to insure, consultants become cautious or refuse appointments. If the insurance market tightens around a particular risk, procurement changes almost immediately. This is not formal regulation, but it behaves like regulation. The difference is that its rules emerge through risk pricing rather than public policy. And that makes it powerful in a very quiet way. Because the insurer may never attend the design meeting. The underwriter may never meet the contractor. The policy wording may never be discussed with the site team. But decisions are shaped around what can be covered. That is a very important point. Construction is not only shaped by building regulations, planning policy, contracts, clients, designers, contractors and funders. It is also shaped by underwriters evaluating risk portfolios. And that changes what the industry considers acceptable. Again, this is not necessarily wrong. Insurance markets respond to real failures. And after major failures, the industry should respond. The public deserves protection. Clients deserve protection. Professionals deserve protection. Unsafe or poorly understood approaches should not simply continue because they are commercially convenient. But there is still a consequence. The boundary of possibility begins to narrow. Certain products become harder to specify. Certain roles become harder to accept. Certain forms of innovation become harder to justify. Certain procurement models become more cautious. Certain risks become commercially toxic. And when that happens, the project team may not even experience it as an insurance issue. They probably experience it as we cannot use that, we cannot get cover for that, the client will not accept it, the warranty provider will not sign it off, the consultant will not take responsibility, the contractor has excluded it, the market has moved. The decision appears technical, but often it is insurability speaking through the project. It is one of those moments where construction reveals something wider about society. We live in a time where accountability is demanded, and rightly so. When something goes wrong, people want to know who was responsible, who signed it off, who designed it, who checked it, who approved it, who installed it, who inspected it, who knew it, who should have known, who let the dogs out. That's one from me. But apart from the last one, those are serious questions. But when a society becomes more liability conscious, industries do not just become safer. They become more defensive. They become more procedural. They become more cautious, really. They become more evidence heavy. They become more focused on providing reasonableness. And construction sits right in the middle of that. Because construction is physical. It is public. It is really expensive. It lasts. It affects lives. It involves many parties. It carries technical uncertainty. It involves commercial pressure. It creates assets that may outlive the people who designed them. So of course liability matters. The problem is not liability itself though. The problem is when liability becomes the dominant logic. Because when liability dominates, the system starts optimizing for defensibility. And defensibility is not the same as quality. It can support quality. It can protect quality sometimes, but it is not the same thing. You can have a defensible decision that is not the best decision. You can have a compliant process that does not create clarity. You can have a fully documented project that is still poorly coordinated. You can have risk transfer that increases project fragility. You can have safety culture that becomes procedural rather than intelligent. That is the uncomfortable bit we sit on. At Bytnar, this is where we often come back to the differences between protection and capability. Protection matters, but protection cannot replace capability. Very often that protection spans out from lack of capability and failure. You can insurance a professional, but that does not make the decision environment mature. You can allocate risk, but that does not make the interface understood. You can require more approvals, but that does not automatically improve judgment. You can demand more evidence, but that does not necessarily create better decisions. You can write stronger contracts, but that does not build trust. You can transfer liability, but that does not make uncertainty disappear. Capability is different. Capability is the ability to understand what is happening early enough to do something useful about it. It is coordination under pressure. It is technical judgment when the answer is not obvious. It is knowing when a process is helping and when it is hiding the issue. It is being able to absorb uncertainty without immediately turning everything into self-protection. It is having people in the room who understand both the technical reality and the commercial consequences. And that is harder to build than a procedure. This is why projects become organizational stress tests. A calm project can make many systems look competent. But pressure reveals the difference between paperwork and capability very quickly. When the program tightens, how does the team behave? When the design changes late, who understands the knock-on effects? When information is incomplete, do people pause intelligently or keep moving defensively? When a risk emerges, is it discussed openly or converted into contractual positioning? When coordination becomes difficult, does the project create clarity or create more documents? When responsibility is unclear, does the team solve the gap or protect itself from the gap? That is where the maturity shows up, not in the policy, in the behavior under pressure. And that is where the insurance state becomes visible. Because when people feel exposed, they do not become more open, they become more careful. They qualify, they caveat, they copy more people into emails, they ask for written confirmation, they avoid informal advice. They stop saying what they think and start saying what they can defend. And when everyone does that at the same time, the project becomes less intelligent. Not because the people are less intelligent, because the system has changed the conditions under which intelligence can operate. That is a phrase worth sitting with. The system changes the conditions under which intelligence can operate. Because good project work depends on people being able to tell the truth early. Not dramatically, not recklessly, but clearly. This is not coordinated. This assumption is weak. The program does not reflect the design maturity. The risk has been allocated but not managed. The detail is buildable only if the sequence changes. That responsibility sits between parties. That sign-off is being treated as technical certainty. But it is not. Those sentences matter. But they require an environment where truth is not immediately punished. And in highly defensive environments, truth becomes dangerous. If you say the issue too clearly, do you inherit it? If you raise the risk, does it become yours? If you advise informally, are you exposed? If you help solve something outside your strict scope, have you created a duty? If you accepted a meeting action, have you accepted responsibility? So people become very careful. And sometimes careful is appropriate. But too much carefulness makes projects stupid. That sounds harsh, I know, but it is true. The intelligence is still in the room, it just stops moving freely. This is one reason why I think the best project environments are not the ones with no protection. They are the ones where protection and trust can coexist. Where responsibilities are clear, but not weaponized. Where documentation exists, but does not replace conversation. Where insurance is respected, but does not paralyze judgment. Where contracts define boundaries, but do not prevent collaboration. Where people can say difficult things early without automatically being punished for honesty. That balance is difficult, but it is essential, because construction ultimately succeeds through something deeper than insurance. It succeeds through competence, trust, collaboration, shared responsibility, technical confidence, and operational maturity. And for a good measure, good judgment under pressure. When those things are strong, the paperwork supports the project. When those things are weak, the paperwork expands to compensate. That is often the pattern I see. The weaker the trust, the heavier the administration. The weaker the capability, the more defensive the process. The weaker the coordination, the more exposed everyone feels. And once exposure rises, protection becomes the priority. Then the project begins to orbit around liability. Now let's bring this down to a very practical situation, shall we? Imagine a design coordination meeting, alright? There is an interface between the structure, the facade, the fire strategy, and the waterproofing. Nothing unusual, right? These are the kind of interfaces projects deal with all the time. But the information is not fully mature. The facade subcontractor has assumptions, the structural engineer has design constraints, the fire consultant has performance requirements, the architect has details that need refinement, the contractor has program pressure, the client wants certainty, the warranty provider may have views, the insurer may have exclusions in the background. Now, in a healthy environment, the conversation focuses on reality. What do we know? What do we don't know? Who needs to confirm what? What is the sequence? What changes if the assumption is wrong? What is the simplest workable route? What decision is needed now and what can wait? That is capability. But in a defensive environment, the conversation starts shifting to who is responsible for this interface? Is that in your scope? Can you confirm that in writing? We cannot proceed unless you accept that. We are not taking responsibility for that. That is outside our appointment. This is contractor design. This is consultant design. That is by others. That is subject to specialist confirmation. That is not included. That is excluded. That is qualified. Again, all of those may be true, and very often that's what you hear in meetings or written in emails. But the project still needs an answer, right? Doesn't it? Without that, it moves nowhere. And if the energy of the meeting goes into positioning rather than understanding, the interface remains fragile. That is where problems begin to build. Not loudly, but quietly. In the gaps between responsibility. This is also why clients and project sponsors need to be careful with the belief that pressure creates clarity. Sometimes it does, but often pressure creates defensiveness. If you force a decision before the environment is mature enough to make it properly, people may not become more decisive. They may become more protective. They will give you an answer full of caveats. They will protect their wording. They will comply procedurally. They will move the risk elsewhere. And the project may appear to progress, but confidence may be going the other way. You can hit a milestone and still weaken the project. What happens more often than people admit? And this is where earlier visibility matters. Because if you identify the uncertainty early, you can still create a useful decision environment around it. You can bring the right people together. You can clarify responsibility without making it adversarial. You can test assumptions. You can decide where technical review is needed. You can decide where additional capability is required. You can decide what needs to be documented because it genuinely matters, not because everyone is frightened. But if you wait until pressure is already high, liability thinking takes over. Then every conversation becomes more loaded. Every decision carries more exposure. Every party becomes more cautious. And at that point, the project stops learning. It starts defending. This is why the insurance state is not just about insurance. It is about decision quality. It is about the way a system built around liability changes how decisions are made. And decision quality is one of the biggest hidden forces in project performance. People often talk about cost, time, quality, risk, scope. But behind those are decisions. When to proceed, when to pause, when to accept, when to reject, when to redesign, when to escalate, when to simplify, when to hold the line, when to absorb a risk, when to share it, when to document it, when to talk, when to bring it in independent review, when to admit uncertainty. And under liability pressure, those decisions change. The safest decision professionally may not be the best decision operationally. The most defensible decision may not be the most efficient. The most cautious decision may not be the most intelligent. The decision that protects one party may weaken the project as a whole. That is the tension. That is the tension. And I do not think this tension can be solved by pretending insurance does not matter. It does, immensely. It has to. The answer is not to remove protection. The answer is to improve the capability around protection. Because a mature project environment should be able to hold both. It should be able to say, yes, we need proper responsibility, yes, we need insurance, yes, we need traceability, yes, we need compliance, yes, we need defensible decisions, but also we need judgment, coordination, people talking early, technical competence, clarity that exists in reality, not only in documents. We need risk visibility before risk transfer. We need assurance that understands the project, not just the procedure. We need commercial arrangements that do not destroy collaboration. We need leadership that can tell the difference between genuine control and administrative comfort. That is a more mature position. And it is harder because it requires people to sit in complexity rather than simply push it away. One of the things I have noticed around projects is that people often know when the system has become too defensive before they can explain why. You hear it in small comments like, everything takes so long now, no one wants to make a decision, we need 5 approvals for something obvious, everyone is covering themselves. It is impossible to get a straight answer. That is not what the meeting was really about. We are spending more time proving than solving. Those comments are not just complaints, they are signals. They tell you something about the project environment. They tell you people may be administrating pressure rather than understanding it. They tell you that responsibility may be fragmented. They tell you trust may be weakening. They tell you decision quality may be under strain. They tell you the system may be protecting itself from the very reality it needs to face. At Bytnar, those signals matter because they often appear before the formal problem. Before the delay, the claim, the dispute, the expensive redesign, before the program recovery meeting, before the relationship breaks down. Projects usually drift before they fail. And defensive behavior is one of the signs of drift. There's another subtle consequence. The insurance state changes innovation. Now, innovation in construction is already difficult. The industry is fragmented, margins can be tight, projects are one-off environments, procurement often rewards lowest price, technical interfaces are complex, approvals can be slow, supply chains are layered, so innovation already has enough resistance. Then add liability, add PI limitation, add warranty requirements, add insurance cautions, add uncertainty around performance, add fear for being first, add the possibility that a new approach may be difficult to defend later. And suddenly, innovation is not only a technical challenge, it is an insurability challenge. It is a reputational challenge. It is a legal challenge. It is a commercial challenge. And this is why some new ideas do not fail because they are bad ideas. They fail because the system cannot comfortably absorb them. That is a very different issue. And it matters because the construction industry is being asked to change. We need to build differently. We need to reduce carbon. We need to improve productivity. We need to deal with housing pressure. We need to retrofit. We need to use materials intelligently. We need to improve quality. We need to make better use of technology. But if the system is over-dominated by liability anxiety, change becomes slow. Not impossible, simply slow. Because every innovation must pass through a gate of defensibility. Can it be insured? Can it be certified? Can it be warranted? Can it be approved, defended? Can it survive scrutiny? Those are valid questions. But if those questions are not matched with capability, the safest answer becomes, do what we did last time. And sometimes that is sensible, but not always. This is why I think the future of construction cannot only be more regulation, more documentation, more insurance, more processes, more governance. Some of that may be needed, but it is not enough. It never was. And the amount of it sprouts from something completely different. The industry first and foremost needs better capability, better technical literacy, better coordination environments, better decision forums, better understanding of interfaces, better maturity in client organizations, better support for contractors carrying real delivery risk, better respect for specialist knowledge, better ways of identifying uncertainty before it becomes exposure. And then better systems to learning from projects instead of only protecting against them. Because if the only answer to every failure is more defensive process, the system becomes heavier and heavier. And eventually, the weight of protection starts affecting the work itself. Like the playground, for example. You can make the playground safer, right? You can lower the structures, you can soften the surfaces, you can add signs, you can remove sharp edges, and some of that is good, of course. But at some point you have to ask, what experience are we creating? Construction has a similar question. We can create safer systems. We should. We can create accountability. Well, we need that, too. We can create traceability. We must. But we also need environments where professionals can think, where competence matters, where judgment is respected, where people are not reduced to liability positions, where collaboration is not treated as exposure, where innovation can be examined seriously rather than rejected defensively, where the project is not only protected but understood. That might be the central point of it all. The insurance state protects construction from certain kinds of failure. Or maybe more subtly, aptly, it protects the organizations. But it can also create different kinds of failure. Failure of trust, failures of coordination, failures of courage, failures of simplicity, failures of judgment, failures of learning, failures of ownership. And those are hard to insure against, because they do not always appear as one event. They appear as culture. They appear as drift. They appear as project taking longer, costing more, feeling heavier, producing more documents, requiring more people to manage the management of the work. And eventually, the industry starts accepting that as normal. That is the dangerous part. Because once a system becomes normal, people stop seeing it as a system. They just call it how things are. So, what do we do with this? I do not think the answer is a simple one. There is no neat conclusion where we say less paperwork, more trust, job done. That would be naive. Trust without competence is dangerous. Innovation without accountability is dangerous. Informality without traceability is dangerous. Optimism without insurance is dangerous. But the reverse is also true. Accountability without trust becomes defensive. Insurance without capability becomes expensive protection. Documentation without understanding becomes noise. Compliance without judgment becomes theater. Risk transfer without risk management becomes fragmentation. So the balance matters, and that balance has to be designed deliberately. At project level, it means asking better questions early. Not just who's responsible if this goes wrong, but who understands this risk? Who has the capability to manage it? Where does the uncertainty actually sit? What information is missing? What decision needs to be made now? What would make this simpler? What needs to be documented because it genuinely changes the risk? What conversation needs to happen before the paperwork hardens? Where might people become defensive? Where is responsibility allocated but not coordinated? Those questions change the environment in which we build. They move the project from protection only towards understanding. And that is where better outcomes usually begin. At organizational level, it means building maturity before pressure arrives. Because you cannot build trust in the middle of a claim. You cannot build technical capability during a crisis. You cannot create healthy decision-making when everyone already feels exposed. You cannot suddenly become collaborative once the project has become adversarial. These things have to exist before they are needed. That is why capability matters. It is why operational maturity matters. It is why lessons learned matters. It is why technical review matters. It is why coordination matters. It is why the client side cannot outsource all understanding and still expects full control. It is why contractors need environments where risks are visible rather than simply passed down. It is why consultants need clear appointments, but also space to exercise professional judgment. And it is why the industry needs to stop confusing more process with more intelligence. This is very much the kind of environment we spend time thinking about at Bytnar. Not because we have some magic answer, we do not. But because these issues sit exactly where technical reality meets organizational behavior. And that is where many project problems actually live. A structural detail may be technical, but why the detail was late, unclear, overcomplicated, unbuildable, over-defended or not properly coordinated, that is often a system question. A risk may be technical, but why it was transferred rather than understood, that is a commercial and organizational question. A project may have insurance, but whether the project has the capability to make good decisions under uncertainty, that is a maturity question. And those questions are worth asking before the project becomes a recovery exercise. Because once everything is already late, defensive and expensive, the options become narrower. Early visibility is not glamorous, but it is powerful. So when I talk about the insurance state, I'm not talking about a villain. There is no villain here. Clients want protection, professionals want cover. Contractors want clarity, insurance want the price risk. Regulators want public safety, lawyers want responsibility defined, funders want asset certainty. Everyone's position makes sense from where they stand. That is exactly why the system is difficult. The problem is not that people are irrational. The problem is that rational behavior is one part of the system can create difficult consequences across the whole project. That is systems work. It is rarely about one bad actor. It is about incentives. And incentives repeated long enough become culture. If the system rewards defensibility, people become defensive. If the system rewards risk transfer, people transfer risk. If the system rewards documentation, people document. If the system punishes uncertainty, people hide uncertainty. If the system punishes honesty, people become vague. If the system makes collaboration feel exposure, collaboration becomes cautious. That is not a moral failure. It is behavior responding to structure. And structures shape behavior faster than slogans do. So maybe the better question is not how do we remove liability from construction? That's impossible. We cannot. And we should not. The better question is how do we stop liability from becoming the only organizing principle? How do we keep accountability without losing judgment? How do we keep insurance without letting insurability quietly decide everything? How do we keep documentation without drowning out understanding? How do we keep contracts without destroying trust? How do we keep protection without making projects afraid of themselves? That is not easy. But it is probably where the next level of maturity sits. Because construction does not need less responsibility. It needs responsibility that is connected to capability. It needs protection that supports good work rather than replacing it. It needs documentation that clarifies reality rather than simply protecting positions. It needs risk conversations before risk becomes conflict. And it needs people who can sit between the technical, commercial, legal, and human realities without pretending any one of them is the whole story. If you are a client, this means looking beyond the comfort of transferring risk. Ask whether the risk is actually understood. Ask whether your project team has the technical and operational capability to manage what has been allocated. Ask where the system may be encouraging silence. Ask where reporting confidence matches real confidence. Ask whether reporting confidence matches real confidence. If you are a contractor, it means noticing when protection is taken over from problem solving. Yes, protect the businesses. You have to. But also recognize when every issue becomes contractual too early, because that can make the project harder to deliver. If you are a consultant, it means respecting your exposure without allowing fear to replace judgment. That's not simple. Professional judgment is harder now because the environment around it is heavier. But it still matters. If you are a project manager, it means understanding that a closed action is not always a resolved risk. A recorded decision is not always a good decision. A meeting minute is not always shared understanding. And if you are leading an organization, it means recognizing that capability must be built before pressure tests it. Because pressure will test it. It always does. The insurance state did not appear from nowhere, right? It grew from real needs, real failures, real claims, real harm, real uncertainty, real financial exposure. And because of that, we should be careful not to dismiss it. A lot of what it created is necessary. Modern construction needs protection. But modern construction also needs to remember that protection is not the same as performance. It is not the same as quality. It is not the same as competence. It is not the same as coordination. It is not the same as trust. And it is not the same as wisdom. Protection is one part of the system. But when it becomes the whole system, the industry changes. Design becomes more defensive, risk becomes more fragmented, documentation becomes heavier, insurers become gatekeepers, innovation becomes harder, decision-making becomes cautious, people become careful with language, and projects become better at proving responsibility than sharing it. That is the uncomfortable truth. Construction ultimately succeeds through shared reality. People need to see the same project clearly enough to act together. Contracts help, insurance help, documentation helps, governance helps. But none of them replace the need for competent people making good decisions in a mature environment. And maybe that is where we should leave it. Not with an argument against insurance, not with an argument against accountability, but with a more careful thought. Every protection system changes behavior. So if we are going to build around liability, we also need to build the capability to stop liability from quietly taking over. Because the safest project is not always the one with the most paperwork. It is not always the one with the most transferred risk. It is not always the one with the most approvals. The safest project is usually the one where reality is understood early enough, responsibility is clear enough, and people are capable enough to act before the system becomes defensive. That is where project holds. That is where trust survives. that is where competence still matters. And that is where construction remains more than a liability machine. There is no neat ending to this one, just the reality of how these things tend to play out. If you are working inside this environment, you probably recognize part of it. The caution, the paperwork, the defensiveness, the need for protection, and also the frustration when protection starts replacing understanding. So hopefully, this gave you a different lens. Not to reject the system outright, but to see it more clearly. Thanks for listening. I'm Piotr Bytnar, and this has been Bytnar Talks. People, projects, profits. Until next time, design the world around you.